Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hasselman, and in this introductory lecture, we're going to be talking about just the classical period in world history. We'll just be looking at some of the basics of this, and then in class, we'll go over some of the specifics between each of these great classical empires. Now, almost all world historians define a period running from roughly 1000, pen to work here, 1000 BCE to approximately 600 CE as the period known as the Classical period. Now, the period saw great activity and many changes, but it takes its basic definition from the rise of three or four major civilizations and the unfolding of their key characteristics. Now, followed by a fairly dramatic decline in each. Now, these features, so we have a rise, and then we've got a decline in each of these different groups. And we're looking at kind of four basic groups that we're looking at here. Now, these features do not define the whole world. Key parts of Northern Europe and many parts of the sub-Saharan Africa, places in Asia such as Japan, and the Americas are kind of left out, though they experience their own historical developments. Now, the largest populations centered in the classical societies, and these societies would also have the greatest impact on later ages, particularly in their own regions, but measurably beyond as well. Now, although the focus remains on civilization, classical societies differed in several ways from their river valley predecessors, whose achievements they all built on. They also developed a few mutual contacts, a point that must be addressed even as primary attention goes to the individual classical centers. Now, the most common way to deal with the classical period is to compare major developments in each center, such as Greece and Rome. But before turning to specific results, this lecture addresses a vital preliminary, what the classical civilizations had broadly in common, which is the same thing as addressing what the classical period as a whole was fundamentally about. Now, as I already mentioned here, the classical period in world history runs from about 1000 to 800 BCE to around 500 or 600 CE. Now, some of the key formative elements of major civilizations, what historians call great traditions, okay, so you might often hear this term, great traditions, were forged in the classical period and would be integrated in world history from this point onward. Now, the classical civilizations were situated in areas where river valley civilizations had flourished earlier, although they usually relocated somewhat and always expanded. China expanded from the north to the southern portion of the Yellow River, forming the Middle Kingdom. So that's in this major river here we'll be looking at right here. Now, Indian civilization spread through the whole subcontinent, but its focus was now on the Ganges River. Again, this major river that flows in here. So that's where we focus in this area. Classical Mediterranean civilization was located in Greece and along the shoreline of the eastern Mediterranean, and ultimately spread westward, both in North Africa and South Europe. So it begins here, but then it begins to spread pretty much all over in this Mediterranean region. And finally, the classical civilization that stayed closest to its river valley's roots was Persia, which is in this region right here, Persia, which had its center in the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, but also spread more widely in the Middle East. Now, the main purpose of this first lecture on the classical period is to highlight some of the common issues among these four civilizations: China, which is right here, China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. So these are our regions that we're going to be looking at: China, India, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Now, we should note two notes before we introduce the classical period. First, the world history approach often treats Greece and Rome as important classical civilizations, but unlike the Western civilization approach, it does not focus solely on these societies. And second, it's important to remember that the classical world was not yet the whole world. Although the classical civilizations would radiate influence to some other societies, some parts of the world that would be important later on were essentially untouched by classical developments. Now, although they all used river valley achievements, these classical civilizations expanded significantly from their predecessors. And at its height, the classical Chinese Empire embraced about 54 million people, and the classical Rome about 52 million people. So let's begin by looking briefly at the individual stories of these civilizations in the classical period. So from the fairly decentralized and often landlord-dominated Zhou dynasty, the Zhao or Zhou dynasty, China made a move to centralization under the Qin. So from the Zhou was decentralized, and we go to the Qin dynasty, Qin, highly centralized. More centralized political and ideology operations, and then we move even further into the Han dynasty, where we get even more centralization. So that's a pattern within China. Now, the classical Mediterranean civilization emphasized the Greek tradition until the 4th century. So we go from Greek tradition to until the conquests of Alexander the Great, and we get what's known as the Hellenistic period. So Greek to Hellenistic period, in which Greek cultural and political influences interacted with the traditions of Egypt and the Middle East. So here we get a mix of Egyptian ideas and Middle Eastern ideas, all mixed into this Hellenistic period. And in this final phase, the civilization emphasis shifted to Rome. So now we go from Greek ideas to Rome, to Hellenistic, to this Roman ideas. And the Republican period and the Empire, which became the most coherent geographic expression of the classical Mediterranean. Now in its heyday, the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Persia was far more important than Greece and had established a strong, effective government. Now the Persian tradition would be partially overshadowed, however, first by the conquests of Alexander, then by the conquests of Arab Islam. So that's this Persian area. So we have a good, strong government, which is very powerful during this time period, but it's often overshadowed by both the Hellenistic period, when the Greeks take over, when Alexander the Great takes over, and Arab Islam kind of filters in as well. And then classical India involves a story of the in-migration of Aryan or Indonesian peoples, Indo-European peoples, whose culture was gradually codified into major works of literature and religious philosophy. India, in this second civilization period, settled down into more recognizable, coherent development, with a major empire in the 4th century BC, known as the Mauryan Empire. Known as the Mauryan Empire. Let me rewrite that here. All right. The Mauryan, hard to spell on this, the Mauryan Empire, and at last, the Gupta Empire. We get a final major imperial statement in that era. So this is kind of the breakdown. So in China, we go from Zhou, a very decentralized area, to Qin, to Han. Mediterranean, we go from a Greek empire to a Hellenistic to the Roman Empire. Persia, we have a strong government, but we get lots of influence from both Hellenistic and Arab Islam, which tend to overshadow it. And then in India, we get the Aryan to the Mauryan to the Gupta. So again, less control to more control to a highly evolved empire. Now, comparison of these civilizations highlights some of the crucial differences among the classical traditions as they emerged in this period. So now we're going to talk about some of the differences. Now, classical China generated, China generated Confucianism. The most important ideological statement in East Asian traditions, as well as Taoism. And sometimes you might spell it with a T as well, but Taoism is what we're going to be talking about here. Now, on the whole, however, China's culture was resolutely secular, and of all the classical traditions, India was the most spiritual. So India was more spiritual, focusing on Hinduism, Brahmanism, and Buddhism. Although this existed a lot of other area, but the importance here was more spiritual, whereas China was more secular. Secular versus spiritual. Now, the Chinese also emphasized more, China also emphasized more empiricism. This is the idea of using science to come up with ideas because of its clear utility to society and the economy. Now, the Greco-Roman scientific tradition, particularly in the Greek and Hellenistic periods, was noticeably more theoretical. China was more empiricism, but focused more on utilitarianism. So in other words, usefulness of these inventions and ideas. Whereas Greece was more theoretical when it came to its scientific ideas. And India also had a strong scientific tradition with an emphasis on the development of mathematics. So here we have India, focused mostly on mathematics. So even though they all had the similar scientific ideas, each of these different regions had their own specifics that they dealt with. Now let's take a look at politically. So politically, the comparison among the society is also very revealing. So ultimately, the Chinese emphasis would be a strong central state, and usually a large bureaucracy. So China, strong state with a bureaucracy. Very, very different idea here. Classical China also emphasized key political concepts that supported the central state, a very specific training system, and at least the beginnings of an examination system for bureaucrats. Now, India experienced two interesting imperial periods and some other periods when larger political units were formed by invaders. But the Indian tradition in this period stressed smaller, decentralized state. So a small, decentralized state, as opposed to the large, centralized state of China, and placed less emphasis on political ideology than either classical China or the Mediterranean. Now, the Mediterranean, our other region here, the Mediterranean, had, like China, a strong political emphasis, although its overall political tradition was more decentralized than that of China. So decentralized at first. The Roman state was somewhat more interested in the development of legal systems as a political unifier rather than the generation of massive bureaucracies. So politics unites everyone rather than dealing specifically with politics having to do with the bureaucracy like they were back here in China. Now, in terms of society, there were striking social differences that arose in India, the Mediterranean, and in China. Now, the Indian caste system, so this, of course, is India. We're talking about society now, so how society is broken up. The Indian caste system was probably the most startling social development in the classical period. Now, caste obligations replaced political obligations in some instances, which helps explain why the Indian political tradition was somewhat less fully developed than was the case elsewhere. Now, in the Mediterranean region, society was noteworthy for its strong reliance on slavery. We don't usually associate this much with this area, but it was, although slavery also existed in India and China as well. And then in classical China, under Confucianism, developed a social hierarchy based on the notion of rule by wise people of the upper class, with the lower classes offering deference in return. Now, if we look at economic comparisons, China and India offer interesting economic comparisons. So in China, for example, it depended heavily on trade. But Confucianism prompted a cultural bias against merchants. So according to Confucius, the merchants were not good, which is kind of counterintuitive considering there was so much trade that China was worried about. And mostly they didn't like them because they were mostly dependent on money making and the possibility that they would pull away from the central and political social values of Chinese society. Now, India placed the most unambiguous emphasis on merchant activities. Merchants were encouraged in India. So merchants were encouraged, and they were encouraged to use the Indian Ocean as an artery for foreign trade. Now, our last thing we're going to look at here is technology, and comparisons can also be made between these great empires. Now, in this period and for several periods thereafter, China would be the most important source of technological innovation in the world. For a long time, a pattern was established by which technologies initially introduced in China would percolate westward. So an example would be in China, we have the printing press that was invented earlier on and eventually spreads west to Europe. Okay, so that's an example. Now in India, it also had a successful emphasis on technologies. So India had an idea of technology, but it was mostly, particularly in steel making. So there was some economic interest there. And the Mediterranean, again, probably had the least well-developed emphasis on production technology, possibly because it tended to expand the slave system. So less technology, more slavery. And you don't really need to expand technology when you have other people doing the work. And the slave system increased production and lessened technological development. Now, this brief overview suggests the possibility of using comparison to highlight some of the interesting differences between these classical societies, but it's not always easy to determine why such different emphases emerged. So China may have, let me go back to that slide there. So China may have focused on political order because of its geography, and the possibility of invasion from Central Asia may have encouraged an emphasis on order to ward off disruption, but the threat was not so great that establishing political order became impossible. India was also affected by invasions and influences from the outside world that came through the passes that led through the Himalayas in northwestern India. And in addition, a hoary historical principle holds that India's emphasis on artistic sensuality and religious fervor could have stemmed from its climate. However, the origin of these separate impulses and traditions, they would tend to solidify and affect these regions not only during the classical period, but well beyond. Now, the classical period gains coherence from two simple developments. Now, these societies were territorially much larger than their river valley predecessors. China expanded geographically several times over, while the classical Mediterranean coalesced into a unit of its own. The Persian Empire was also larger in virtually any of its river valley predecessors. Indian civilizations, and spreading through the south continent, embraced a territory vastly larger, more diverse, and more complicated than Harappan civilization had been previously. Now, crucial in this expansion was the fact that these civilizations all had access to iron technologies. And this is very important here. Iron technologies. Technologies here. So this is very important. Iron technologies. Which were introduced from about 1500 BCE onward. So about from 1500 BCE onward. Now, these technologies would serve to underwrite more elaborate and effective production and an expansion of military capacity. Military capacity. That's very important to think about here. Now, leaders in these societies also saw clear advantage in terms of population expansion to enlarge their economic, cultural, and political territories. So a larger technology or a larger population, for example, equals more tax revenue. So that's very popular during this time period, something really important to remember. Now, further, these societies were now comfortable with the apparatus of civilization as a form of human organization, which may have meant that basic developments could be used in combination with new technologies to expand further. Now, with the partial exception of the Mediterranean, the achievements of these classical civilizations represented fairly durable expansions of their territories. In later periods, China would be truncated geographically, but for most of world history, China is associated with the territory that was established in this period. The same holds for India, if we view India as a cultural unit, not simply a political one. The same may hold to some degree for the recurrent reassertions of the Persian Commission. Now, following expansion of these societies, all of them faced the need to develop an apparatus of integration that would allow the expanded territories to successfully use and maintain their resources. Now, in China, the government relocated, so we have some relocation of the governments. So China, for example, relocated northern Chinese from the Yellow River Valley into the south to develop population loyalty amid the diverse ethnic and linguistic picture of South China. Rome, in its imperial period, also relocated groups of Roman citizens as well as military garrisons to unify its territory. So they have relocation of the population, specifically by government officials, in order to control and maintain and to better keep people under control. So one of the things that a lot of these empires have is this this idea of control. Now, the classical periods also emphasized three basic integrating devices. Now, perhaps the most obvious device was economic integration. Now, all these societies traded to some extent beyond their borders, so trade was very important. And all these, but primarily they focused on economic communication and trade patterns that would connect the various parts of the expanded territory. Now, the Chinese promoted regular interaction between the wheat-growing regions of North China and the rice-growing regions of South China. So we'll do here, so China, wheat in the north, and rice in the south. And it was very important that these two areas stayed connected. The Mediterranean region, rulers and merchants eagerly developed contacts with grain-growing regions, such as North Africa and Sicily. So we have Greece focusing on trade with North Africa and Sicily, mostly for wheat in this sense. Now, a second integrating device was culture. In the 6th and 17th century, all these societies introduced key cultural systems. So we have Confucianism in China, for example, and also Taoism were introduced. In India, we have Buddhism and Hinduism. In Persia, we have Zoroastrianism and philosophy in the Greek world. So Confucianism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, philosophy. These cultural systems were expanded throughout each empire, at least among the elites, to provide something of a cultural glue. And the most complicated device was political integration. In all cases, there was an effort to take advantage of the territorial expansion of the civilization and to build imperial structures that would foster and reinforce economic and cultural coherence. Now, throughout this period, the imperial tradition was more of a reoccurring effort than a consisting one. And the result of integration is seen in achievements that later societies in these regions and elsewhere would look back on with awe and reverence. Thus, each of the classical traditions outlived its own existence by creating identities, value systems, and institutions for a variety of societies that would come later on. Now, we call this period classical because it was both formative and later revered. We will see institutions, cultural and artistic patterns, and even economic and technological values crop up later that hark back to the legacy of these societies in this important period in world history.